Mark sat in the quiet of his small apartment, the weight of his decision pressing on his chest. He could still feel the coolness of the rain that had soaked him on his way to the bistro earlier, a stark contrast to the warm, polished world Eleanor had introduced him to. He thought about her proposition, marry her for a year, in exchange for the financial freedom he had longed for. He had never imagined his life would take such a turn, but the debt he was drowning in, the weight of his father's legacy, was too heavy to ignore. He needed the escape she offered, and despite the unconventional nature of it, he was willing to take the chance. The following day, Mark received a message from Eleanor. "Meet me at my office at 3 p.m. We will begin the arrangements." It was to be the first step in what felt like an impossible journey, and yet, he could not shake the feeling that something big was about to unfold. As he entered the sleek, modern office building, he felt like a fish out of water. The glass walls, the polished floors, the scent of fresh coffee in the air, everything screamed wealth. Eleanor was already there, sitting behind a large mahogany desk, her expression calm and confident, as if this kind of arrangement was something she did every day. She gestured for him to sit. "You're here. I want to make sure we're clear on the terms," she said, her voice smooth and businesslike. Mark nodded, sitting across from her. He still couldn't quite believe what he was getting into. "All right," he said, trying to steady his nerves. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his face. "There are a few things we need to establish. First, this marriage will be strictly business. No romantic involvement. We will attend public events together, but we will maintain separate lives when not in the public eye." She paused, watching him closely, and then added, "Second, you will be required to uphold a certain standard in my social circles. You'll need to blend in, be presentable at all times. No questions, no disruptions." Her tone softened just a little. "Lastly, we will keep the details of our arrangement confidential. This marriage will not be a public spectacle, and no one outside our inner circle will know the truth." Mark swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. It felt like a strange contract, binding him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He cleared his throat, trying to sound confident, though his mind was racing. "And in return, you'll clear my debts?" Eleanor's eyes flickered with something that Mark couldn't quite place. "Yes, and I will ensure that you have a comfortable future. The financial support will come from me, as promised. But, understand, there are no strings attached beyond the business side of this." Mark nodded, still trying to process the enormity of what he was about to agree to. Eleanor continued, "I expect this to be a smooth arrangement, Mark. If you ever break the terms of our agreement, there will be consequences." Her voice was steady, but the implication of her words was clear. Mark took a deep breath. It was too late to back out now. His future, his stability, depended on him following through with this bizarre deal. "All right," he said, "I'll do it. But I have one condition." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What is it?" she asked. Mark met her gaze, his voice low. "I want to make sure this doesn't destroy me in the process. I want to maintain some level of dignity in this." Eleanor considered his words for a moment before giving him a small, approving smile. "I'm not here to destroy you, Mark. I'm giving you a chance to rebuild." She extended her hand. "Shall we begin?" He hesitated for a moment, then shook her hand, sealing the strange pact between them. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Eleanor's team handled all the legal paperwork, the official documents, and the arrangements for the wedding. Mark was thrust into a world that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Eleanor was everywhere, guiding him through each step, her calm demeanor never faltering. The wedding was planned for 2 weeks later, a small, private affair that would take place at one of Eleanor's luxurious estates. Mark had no idea what to expect, but he knew this was a turning point in his life. No matter how strange it seemed, this was his chance to escape the suffocating grip of his debts. As the day of the wedding approached, Mark's nerves began to show. He had never been the center of attention in this way, and now, his life would be broadcasted to a small circle of influential people. He stood in front of the mirror in his rented tuxedo, adjusting his tie nervously. This wasn't the life he had imagined for himself. But then, he thought about the financial security that would follow, the freedom from the debts that had held him hostage for so long. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. The wedding day arrived, and Mark found himself standing at the altar, staring at Eleanor. She looked stunning, her silver hair cascading down her back in soft waves, her expression serene and composed. The ceremony was brief, with only a handful of close friends and business associates present. Mark was surprised by how little emotion he felt. The whole thing felt surreal, almost like a dream. As they exchanged vows, he couldn't help but wonder how long it would take before their arrangement became something real, or if it ever would. As they walked down the aisle, the guests clapping politely, Mark looked at Eleanor. She caught his gaze and gave him a small, reassuring smile. In that moment, he realized that this was just the beginning. He had no idea what would happen next, but he couldn't help but feel that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't even predict. The days following the wedding were a blur of meetings, events, and the overwhelming reality of Mark's new life. At first, everything felt surreal. He was living in a world of luxury he had never known before, his days filled with business functions, high-end dinners, and meeting influential people in Eleanor's circle. His new wife, Eleanor, remained calm and composed, guiding him through each event with the ease of someone who had been in this world her entire life. But as time passed, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The contract, the formality of their arrangement, was clear. No romance, no feelings, just a business deal. But as much as he tried to convince himself that this was fine, a part of him felt empty. One evening, after a long day of charity events, Mark found himself alone in their shared home. Eleanor had left for another meeting, and he was left with nothing but his thoughts. He sat in the grand living room, staring out the window at the sprawling city below, feeling the weight of his decision settle in. He had been so focused on escaping his debts that he hadn't really considered the emotional cost of this arrangement. He wasn't sure what he had expected, maybe some sense of freedom, of relief, but all he felt now was a sense of isolation. He had married for money, for stability, but what about love? That night, Eleanor came home later than usual. She was dressed in a tailored suit, looking as pristine as ever. As she entered, she noticed Mark sitting in the dim light, deep in thought. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying an edge of concern. Mark looked up, meeting her eyes. "Yeah, just thinking," he replied, his voice low. Eleanor gave him a small smile, but there was something about her expression that suggested she was more than just an observer of their arrangement. "We're in this together, Mark. Don't forget that," she said, her words surprisingly gentle. For a moment, Mark wondered if he had misjudged Eleanor. She had always kept things businesslike, her emotions hidden behind a professional facade. But that small gesture, her concern, her reminder, made him question if there was more to her than he had assumed. Maybe this wasn't just a transaction for her. Maybe she, too, was navigating this strange new world they had created. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Mark began to attend more events with Eleanor, and slowly, he started to feel more comfortable in her world. He adapted to the formalities, the social niceties, and even began to enjoy some of the gatherings. He noticed the way Eleanor commanded respect from everyone around her, her presence undeniable. Despite her seemingly cold demeanor, there was an aura of power and grace that he couldn't ignore. She was a woman who had everything, and yet, Mark began to wonder if she ever felt as lonely as he did. One evening, after a gala, they were walking back to their estate when Eleanor turned to him with an unexpected question. "Mark, do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had met under different circumstances?" she asked, her voice quiet. Mark was taken aback. He had never thought about it that way. "What do you mean?" he asked, genuinely curious. Eleanor's gaze softened as she looked at him, her expression more vulnerable than he had ever seen. "If you hadn't needed the money, if I didn't have this agenda," she paused. "What if we had just met as two people, not bound by contracts and business deals?" The question lingered in the air, leaving Mark with a strange sense of unease. He had never really considered the possibility of real feelings between them. In his mind, this had always been a practical arrangement. But now, the line between what was real and what was fake seemed to blur. The next morning, Mark found himself lost in thought. He couldn't stop replaying Eleanor's words. What if there was more to this? What if they could find something real, even in the midst of this bizarre situation? But every time he thought about it, doubt crept in. Was he imagining things? Was Eleanor really capable of real affection, or was she simply following through with her own plan, just like he was? That afternoon, Eleanor called him into her office. There was a tense look on her face as she sat behind her desk, papers scattered in front of her. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady but serious. Mark felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What now? What's wrong?" he asked, bracing himself. Eleanor's eyes flickered to him, her gaze hardening slightly. "There's something I need to address," she said, her tone more businesslike. "I've been hearing rumors. About us." Mark froze. "What kind of rumors?" he asked, anxiety rising in his chest. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her expression unchanged. "People are starting to question the legitimacy of our marriage. I need you to be on your best behavior. This could get messy." Mark nodded, trying to hide the unease that had settled deep in his gut. He had known this day would come. The scrutiny, the judgment, but it still made his heart race. This wasn't just a marriage on paper anymore. It was starting to feel real in ways he hadn't anticipated. As the tension built between them, Mark began to realize that this contract marriage was evolving into something far more complicated than he had ever expected. He was beginning to see Eleanor in a new light, not just as a business partner, but as a woman who had been hiding her own pain, her own fears. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one who had something to lose. Mark sat in the living room, his mind racing after his conversation with Eleanor. The tension between them had been building over the past few weeks, and now, the rumors about their marriage were beginning to spread. He could feel the pressure mounting, both from Eleanor's expectations and from the people around them. He had tried so hard to keep his distance emotionally, to keep everything business as usual, but it was becoming more difficult with each passing day. He glanced at the clock on the wall, his mind not really focused on time, but on the strange pull he felt towards Eleanor. It wasn't just her beauty or her wealth. It was something deeper, something more elusive. He had never imagined he would be in this situation, and now, he found himself questioning everything. What was he really getting out of this arrangement? The sound of the door opening interrupted his thoughts. Eleanor stepped into the room, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she approached. Mark stood up, not sure what to expect. Her face was calm, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that he had come to recognize when something was bothering her. She didn't speak at first, just looked at him for a long moment. Finally, she broke the silence. He took a deep breath and met her gaze. "I thought we were clear on the terms," he said, his voice steady though. His heart was racing. "This is just business. We're both in it for the same reason." Eleanor didn't seem convinced. She shook her head slightly. "Business," she repeated, as if the word tasted bitter on her tongue. "Yes, that's what we agreed to. But somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like just business. Don't you feel it, Mark?" Mark swallowed hard. He hadn't expected her to say that. It was as if she could read his mind, as if she knew exactly what he had been trying to suppress, the growing feelings he was starting to have for her. He had been fighting it, convincing himself that this was just a deal. But deep down, he knew something had changed. The line between fake and real had blurred. Mark was silent for a moment, his thoughts swirling. Eleanor's vulnerability, her honesty, threw him off balance. He had always seen her as a woman who had it all together, who knew exactly what she wanted. But now, he realized there was more to her than he had ever considered. She wasn't just a powerful businesswoman. She was a person struggling with her own emotions and insecurities. Eleanor's expression softened, and for a moment, Mark thought he saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. She stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his. "You won't let me down, Mark," she said quietly. "But you have to decide. What do you want from this? Because I can't keep pretending that this is just a business arrangement if neither of us is being honest about what we're feeling." Mark felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. He had never been good at expressing his feelings, especially not in a situation like this. But as he looked at Eleanor, truly looked at her, he realized something. He didn't want to lose her. Even if their marriage had started as a lie, he didn't want it to stay that way. He had to make a choice. Eleanor's lips curled into a small, tentative smile. "Then let's take that risk together," she said softly. And for the first time since their wedding, Mark felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, this fake marriage could become something real after all. The days after their conversation felt different. There was an unspoken shift between Mark and Eleanor, something that neither of them had anticipated but both secretly hoped for. The tension that had lingered for so long now seemed to ease. though it was replaced by something else, a sense of anticipation, of uncertainty. Mark found himself looking at Eleanor in a way he never had before. She was no longer just the woman he had entered into a business arrangement with. She was someone he was beginning to care about. The line between what was real and what was fake had blurred completely, and neither of them seemed to know how to navigate it. Mark spent more time with Eleanor, attending charity events and gatherings, but now, things felt more genuine. He could no longer play the role of the perfect husband without feeling the weight of his emotions. Eleanor, too, seemed to soften in her interactions with him, her professional mask slipping just enough for Mark to catch glimpses of the person she was underneath. They still held on to the structure of their arrangement, but now there was an understanding between them, an understanding that their feelings were starting to surface, even if neither of them wanted to admit it. One evening, after a particularly extravagant gala, Eleanor and Mark found themselves in the quiet of their home, the noise of the event still echoing in their minds. Mark was standing by the window, looking out at the city lights, when he felt a presence behind him. He turned to find Eleanor standing there, her expression thoughtful. Eleanor looked up at him, her lips trembling slightly as she spoke. "Mark, I didn't expect any of this either. I came into this with my own agenda, but somewhere along the way, you became more than just a business partner. You became someone I care about." There was a long pause before she added, "Maybe I'm scared. Scared that what we have isn't real. Scared that I'll let myself fall for you, and it'll all crumble." Mark reached out, taking her hand in his. "We can't be sure of everything. But I do know this, Eleanor. I'm willing to take that risk. I want to be with you, not because of a contract, but because of what we've built together." The room was quiet, the weight of his words hanging in the air. For a long moment, Eleanor just stood there, her hand in his, looking at him as if seeing him for the first time. Then, finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I think we might have something real here, Mark." Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him, though there was still an undeniable uncertainty about the future. But for the first time in their strange, unconventional marriage, he felt like they were finally on the same page. The next few weeks passed in a blur of quiet moments and shared understanding. Mark and Eleanor continued to attend events together, but there was now a new sense of intimacy between them. They spoke more honestly, shared more about their fears and dreams, and slowly, their bond grew stronger. Mark still had moments of doubt, moments when he wondered if he was just chasing an illusion. But as the days went on, he began to see that this wasn't just a business arrangement anymore. It was something more. One afternoon, Eleanor took Mark to one of her favorite spots, a small, secluded garden just outside the city. As they sat on the bench, surrounded by the beauty of nature, Eleanor turned to him, a soft smile on her face. "This is where I come when I need to think," she said. "It's peaceful here. No distractions. No expectations." Mark looked around, taking in the tranquility of the place. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice full of awe. Eleanor's gaze softened as she looked at him. "You're not the only one with doubts, Mark. I've spent my life building this empire, trying to control everything around me. But now, with you, I'm starting to realize that control isn't everything. Maybe it's time to let go, to trust in something real." Mark reached for her hand, his heart swelling with affection. "I'll be here," he said, his voice steady. "No matter what happens." In that moment, Mark realized that this was the beginning of something new, something real. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would still be challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. With Eleanor by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. The weeks passed, and Mark and Eleanor's connection grew deeper. They no longer felt like strangers caught in a business arrangement, but like two people who had somehow found each other in a world full of uncertainty. The line between fake and real had almost completely faded, and now, every time they spoke, every touch, every glance, seemed to carry more meaning. But there were still moments of doubt, moments when Mark found himself questioning whether this was truly love or just the comfort of familiarity. He had been through so much in his life, so much loss and so many compromises, that it was hard for him to trust anything or anyone without questioning its authenticity. One evening, they attended a high-profile charity event hosted by one of Eleanor's closest friends. Mark had grown used to the lavish parties and the constant chatter of wealthy business people, but tonight felt different. Eleanor was unusually quiet, her usual poise replaced by a subtle tension Mark couldn't ignore. As they mingled with the crowd, Mark could feel her anxiety, and it puzzled him. Was she still unsure about them? Or was there something else weighing on her mind? Later that night, after the event, they were alone in the back of the limo, the city lights flickering outside the window. Eleanor sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed ahead. Mark watched her, sensing that something was off. "Eleanor," he said softly, breaking the silence. "Is something wrong?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering to him for just a moment before she looked away again. "I'm just tired, I guess," she said, her voice distant. Mark knew better than to accept that as the full truth, but he didn't press. They had come so far in their relationship, but there were still walls between them, walls that neither of them had been willing to break down completely. He wanted to reach out to her, to comfort her, but something held him back. As the limo came to a stop in front of their home, Mark turned to Eleanor, his voice quiet but firm. "You know you don't have to carry all of this on your own, right? We're in this together." Eleanor looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, it felt like she was weighing something, whether to let him in, to truly open up. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Mark, it's not that simple," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've spent my entire life building this empire, controlling everything around me. And now I'm scared. Scared that if I let go, everything will fall apart." Her voice cracked slightly, and Mark could see the vulnerability she had been hiding for so long. He reached out, placing a hand on hers, a simple gesture, but it felt like a promise. "I'm not going anywhere, Eleanor. You don't have to carry it all alone anymore. I'm here. I've got your back." Eleanor's eyes softened, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to relax into the comfort of his touch. "Thank you," she whispered. It was the first time she had allowed herself to truly lean on someone, and for Mark, it felt like a breakthrough. He had never seen her like this, fragile, human, real. Over the next few days, Eleanor slowly began to open up more. She shared her fears about her business, the pressure she felt to constantly prove herself, and the loneliness that had been with her for so long. Mark listened patiently, offering support and understanding, but he also realized something important. This wasn't just about helping Eleanor fix her problems, it was about being there for each other, about building something real together, not just a marriage of convenience. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, Eleanor turned to him with a look of quiet resolve. "Mark," she said softly, "I've been thinking about everything. About us. And I think it's time we stop pretending. Stop pretending that this is just business. I want to see what we can be together. I want to build something real." Mark's heart raced at her words. He had been hoping for this, but hearing it from her still took him by surprise. He took her hand, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I've wanted that too, Eleanor. I think I've been scared to admit it, but I want to be with you. Not because of a contract, but because I believe in us." He paused, looking into her eyes. "I believe in you." The words hung between them, filled with the weight of everything they had been through. Eleanor smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Then let's stop pretending," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "Let's stop pretending that we're anything other than what we are, a team." Mark smiled back, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and excitement. This was it. This was the moment where everything changed. No more pretending. No more walls between them. They were ready to face whatever came next, together. As they stood up from the bench, their fingers intertwined, Mark felt a new sense of purpose. It wasn't just about escaping his past anymore. It wasn't just about fixing Eleanor's life. It was about the two of them, carving out a future where they could be real, where they could finally build something worth having. And for the first time, Mark felt like he had found his place. Not just in Eleanor's world, but in his own life. The days after their conversation felt like a new beginning. Mark and Eleanor were no longer pretending. The walls between them had fallen, and they began to build a real connection, one that was grounded in mutual trust and respect. They spent more time together, talking about everything, about their pasts, their fears, and their hopes for the future. They no longer felt like two people forced into a marriage, but two people who were choosing each other, day by day. One afternoon, as they sat together in the study, Eleanor broke the silence. "Mark, I've been thinking about the future. About what we want, not just in business, but in our lives. I think we need to make a decision. Her voice was calm, but Mark could sense the seriousness behind her words. He looked up from the book he had been reading, his brow furrowed in curiosity. What kind of decision? He asked, setting the book aside. Eleanor took a deep breath, her fingers brushing over the pages of the notebook in front of her. We've been living in this in-between space for a while now. And while I'm glad we're finally being honest with each other, I think it's time we decide what comes next. Do we keep this going, or do we walk away? Mark's heart skipped a beat. The question, though expected, still hit him like a wave. The thought of walking away from Eleanor, after everything they had shared, felt unimaginable. But he knew the decision was inevitable. There was only so long they could keep pretending that they were simply partners in a contract. If they were going to make this real, they needed to take the next step. He met her gaze, his voice steady. I don't want to walk away, Eleanor. I think I've known that for a while now. I want to be with you. Eleanor's expression softened, and for the first time in weeks, Mark saw her vulnerability. She hadn't been one to show weakness, not in front of others, and certainly not to him. But in this moment, she was allowing herself to be real with him. I'm scared, Mark, she said quietly, her eyes searching his face. I'm scared of what this means, of what it could cost. I've spent my whole life building my career, my empire. Letting someone in, truly trusting someone, it's terrifying. Mark reached out, gently taking her hand in his. I know, he said softly, but I'm not asking you to trust me right away. I just want us to try. Together. He squeezed her hand, trying to convey everything he felt in that one gesture. Eleanor looked down at their hands, her thumb gently tracing the back of his. After a moment, she nodded. Okay, she whispered. I'll try. I'll trust you. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the right one. The weight that had hung between them for so long started to lift. They weren't just partners anymore. They were two people choosing to take a chance on each other, to see what could come from their connection. The next few days were filled with small, but meaningful moments. They went on walks together, shared quiet dinners, and even laughed about things they had never discussed before. The more time they spent together, the more Mark realized how much he had come to care for her. He wasn't just in this for the convenience of marriage anymore. He was in it because he wanted to be with Eleanor, to build something real with her. One evening, as they were sitting on the balcony overlooking the city, Eleanor turned to him. Mark, she began, her voice low, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about trying. And I think I'm ready to take that leap. I want to build something real too. Not just for the cameras, or the company, but for us. Mark's heart swelled with emotion. He had never expected to find something like this, especially not in a situation so complicated. But here they were, choosing each other, making their own path. He smiled at her, his voice filled with warmth. Then let's do it, he said simply. Let's build something real. They sat together in the fading light, their hands still intertwined, the city's lights twinkling below them. For the first time since their strange beginning, Mark felt a deep sense of peace. No matter what happened next, they had both decided to take the leap, to trust in each other. And that was all that mattered. Weeks passed, and the shift in Mark and Eleanor's relationship was undeniable. They had crossed a threshold, no longer bound by a contract, but by something more genuine. Their days were filled with shared laughter, meaningful conversations, and a growing sense of partnership. Mark could no longer remember what life had been like before Eleanor. Every moment with her felt real now, more than he ever expected. They were building something together, something that was slowly becoming a foundation they could both stand on. Yet, as the days passed, Mark felt that there was still something looming over them, something unspoken. He wasn't sure if it was fear, doubt, or simply the weight of what they had both been through, but he sensed Eleanor still held back a piece of herself. The wall she had built over the years had not fully come down, even if she was letting him in. Mark knew this was the next step. He had to help her break down those last barriers. One evening, after a quiet dinner, Mark turned to Eleanor as they sat on the balcony, the cool night air surrounding them. He had been thinking about the future, about what they were building, but there was one thing left to confront. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was perfect. He needed to know if Eleanor was as ready as he was to make this real. Eleanor, he said softly, his voice steady but filled with the weight of his thoughts. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Eleanor looked at him, her expression calm but cautious. She tilted her head slightly, waiting for him to continue. Are you still holding back? Are you still afraid of letting go? He could see the flicker of hesitation in her eyes before she looked away, her fingers tracing the edge of her wine glass. She didn't answer right away, and Mark's heart began to race. He had asked the question, but now he wasn't sure if he was ready for the answer. It's not that simple, Mark, she said. Finally, her voice quieter than usual. I've spent my whole life controlling everything around me. Letting go, trusting someone with everything, it's terrifying. I know I've let you in more than I've let anyone else, but there's still a part of me that's afraid. Mark listened, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He could feel the walls she had built, and he understood that they weren't just barriers to their relationship. They were walls she had built to protect herself from pain. But he wasn't asking her to forget her past. He was asking her to trust him with it. Eleanor's gaze softened as she looked at him, and for a moment, there was a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. I want to be with you, Mark. I really do. But I don't know how to completely let go. I don't know how to let myself be vulnerable. Mark reached for her hand, gently holding it in his. You don't have to be perfect, Eleanor. You don't have to have all the answers. I'm not asking you to let go all at once. But what I'm asking is for you to take this step with me. We've come this far, and I believe we can go further. Together. He squeezed her hand, trying to convey everything he felt without words. Eleanor took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around his. I know, she whispered, I know. And I want to take that step. But it's not going to be easy. Mark smiled softly, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. It's not going to be easy for either of us. But I'm willing to face it with you. Every step of the way. They sat in silence for a while, the night growing quieter around them. Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder, and Mark wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. For the first time, he felt like they were truly together, not just as a couple bound by a contract, but as two people choosing each other, trusting each other. There was no guarantee of what the future would hold, but in that moment, Mark knew one thing for certain. He was no longer walking this path alone. As they sat there, wrapped in the stillness of the night, Mark realized that this journey had changed him. He had come into this marriage with nothing but a need for security and stability, but what he had found was so much more than that. He had found someone he could build a future with, someone who, despite her walls, had allowed him to get closer than anyone ever had. And as Eleanor leaned into him, Mark knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. This was only the beginning. Months passed, and Mark and Eleanor's bond only grew stronger. What started as a business arrangement had blossomed into something deep and meaningful. The walls that once separated them, both physically and emotionally, had crumbled. Eleanor had allowed herself to be vulnerable in ways she never had before, and Mark had become more than just her husband. He had become her partner, her equal. The transition from two strangers playing roles to two people genuinely in love was not without its challenges, but each challenge only brought them closer. Eleanor had learned to trust, and Mark had learned that sometimes the things you're afraid of most are the things that are worth fighting for. Together, they were building a life neither had expected, but one that felt more real than anything either of them had imagined. One evening, after a long day of meetings and events, they returned to their estate. The house felt different now, more like a home, filled with laughter and the quiet comfort of their shared moments. As they sat together on the couch, Eleanor turned to Mark, her eyes full of emotion. Mark, she began, her voice soft but steady. I've been thinking about how far we've come, and I realized something. This isn't just about a contract anymore. This isn't about what we thought it would be when we started. It's about us. It's about what we've built together. Mark smiled, his heart full of warmth. I know. It's funny, isn't it? We started this as a way out, as a solution to problems neither of us could face alone. But now, I can't imagine my life without you. Eleanor's gaze softened, and she leaned into him. I never thought I'd feel this way, Mark. But you've become my everything. And I think I've finally let go of the fear that kept me from fully embracing this. Embracing us. Mark took her hand, his voice filled with sincerity. You don't have to be afraid anymore. I'm here. I've always been here. Even when it felt like we were just pretending. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with emotion. I'm ready now, she whispered. Ready to make this real. Ready to make us real. Mark leaned in and kissed her gently, a kiss that spoke of everything they had been through, everything they had become, and everything they were still yet to discover. The following week, at a quiet dinner with a few close friends, Mark found himself reflecting on how much had changed. The man he was now was no longer the man who had entered into a marriage of convenience. He was someone who had found love, trust, and partnership in a place he never expected. As the evening drew to a close, Eleanor stood up, taking his hand in hers. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," she said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "I used to think I had to do everything on my own, that I had to control every aspect of my life. But now, I see that the best parts of life come when you let go, when you trust." Mark smiled, his heart swelling with pride for the woman beside him. "I've learned that, too," he said softly. "Life is better when we face it together, and there's no one else I'd rather face it within you." In that moment, Mark realized that all the doubts, all the fears, all the uncertainty of the past had led him to this place. A place where he could say, without hesitation, that he had found the love he didn't know he was looking for. A love that was real, not born out of necessity, but out of choice. As they left the dinner, hand in hand, Mark knew that this was just the beginning. The future was uncertain, but with Eleanor by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next. And so, their story continued. Not as a marriage built on a contract, but as a partnership forged in honesty, trust, and love. They had found something real, something worth fighting for. Together, they would face the future, not as two people bound by an agreement, but as two souls intertwined, ready for whatever life had in store.